Oh, good morning, protege, or of course, good afternoon to my wonderful eighth period class. Hey, I hope this direct instructional Zoomcast finds you well. So this is going to be my very first direct instructional Zoomcast as we get into Unit 2, the Roaring Twenties, and of course, the Great Depression. So we'll be finishing up this unit literally right before Thanksgiving break. So this will be my direct instruction, first one for Unit 2. On Tuesday, October 12th, 2021. Happy Indigenous Peoples Day. Let's get into it, shall we? You guys know the drill at this point. So I'm going to share my screen with everybody. So at this point, I would like everybody to please go and take out, of course, you need a blue or black pen. You need your highlighters, multiple colored highlighters. I'm going to ask you to not highlight until I am done with the Zoomcast. I want you to be focusing, listening, and taking copious notes. You can clean up and highlight your ISN later on. Speaking of which, you will also need your correctable tape. All right, so I need everybody to now skip, again, one full page in your ISNs. You're going to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. Make certain that you date your notes for today. We're going to take multiple sets of notes today. It's going to be October 12th, or I like to call the month Rocktober 12th, 2021. And you're going to write down for me Unit 2, the Roaring Twenties. Now, again, Unit 2 actually consists of two parts. You got the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression. So the first part will be the Roaring Twenties, and then we'll just segue right into the Great Depression. So there will be times, again, I will be going a little faster, and it's really simple. I can do that because I know you have the luxury of pausing the Zoomcast, affording you the opportunity of getting caught up. If you miss something, you can always rewind it just a little bit, watch it again. That's the whole one of the reasons why I really love these Zoomcasts and will continue to do it for the foreseen future. So ladies and gentlemen, if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, I'd like you to put your pens down for just a few moments. I have two photographs for you. So this photograph are of a group of women, or a small group of women, 4 of them, exact number, and they're called flappers. Flappers were very, very common during what we call the Roaring Twenties, between 1921 and 1930. Then I have another photograph for you. So these 4 women known as flappers, they were, again, when you think of the Roaring Twenties, you think of flappers. And then this is a seminal photograph from the Great Depression. It's a woman, a mother, with her 2 children. And this photograph on your right truly encapsulates the essence of the Great Depression. This photograph on your left truly encapsulates the essence of the Roaring Twenties, a time of tremendous change, political change, economic change, but especially social change. So notice again 4 women on the photograph on the left, the flappers. How are they dressed? What are they doing in this photograph? Something that young women love to do. What are they wearing in terms of their clothes and on their faces? And I want you to notice too, their expressions. Then I want you to look at the photograph on the right of the woman, the mother, during the Great Depression with her 2 children. Look at her expression. Look at her clothes. You see a little difference? All right, ladies and gentlemen, here's what I want you to do. I want you to skip a full page. You're going to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. Don't worry, we're going to come back to those notes in a moment. So on the right side of the next clean sheet of paper, I want you to date your notes for today. It's October 12th. It's 2021. And of course, it's Tuesday, 2 for Tuesday, 2 for Tuesday. I say double the pleasure. You say double the fun. And on your topic heading on the top line, you're going to write down for me visual discovery flappers. So again, think about that photograph that I just shared with you a few moments ago of the flappers from the Roaring Twenties. And then think of that photograph of that mother and her 2 children at the height of the Great Depression. So once again, here's that photograph of the flappers. Again, so commonplace. If I'm looking for the zeitgeist, the essence of the Roaring Twenties and what this decade was about, I always think about the flappers. And then I want you to notice this photograph of these women to your right. And I want you to notice also, now these women were probably the mothers of these women right here. And I want you to notice the way they're dressed compared to the flappers, who could be their daughters. Their hairstyles, their expressions. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to be pausing the Zoomcast now for about 6 to 8 minutes. When you pause the Zoomcast, you're going to write for me a 3-paragraph reflection. Paragraph number 1, I want you to thoroughly describe for me this photograph on your left of the flappers. The way they're dressed, the way they're acting, what they're doing. Then I want you to again skip a line, move on to the next paragraph, indent, and the same thing again, but this time you're going to describe these 3 women from the Victorian era, the late 1800s. And again, be specific. Describe the way they're dressed. And then finally, this is going to be the 3rd paragraph. This is the hardest one. So in the 3rd paragraph, you're going to compare and contrast these 2 photographs, the flappers on your left, the women on the right from the Victorian era, late 1800s. Compare means how are they similar? Contrast means how are they alike? So I want you in the last paragraph to compare and contrast the flappers on your left with the Victorian women on your right. How are they alike? How are they different? Because if once you understand that, you're going to have a much better perspective of what the Roaring Twenties were all about. All right, let's continue on. Now, you're again going to pause the Zoomcast for about 5 to 8 minutes. I'm going to continue on. So I want you to go back to the previous page and notes, and let's get into it, shall we? So when you talk about the Roaring Twenties, now again, we're going to be focusing chapters 26 through 29. The Roaring Twenties, which is now the 100th anniversary. We are now 100 years from the start of this wonderful decade, a time of tremendous change. And when that's the word that always comes to my mind when I think about the Roaring Twenties. If you look at life in America in 1921 and you look at life in America in 1930, it's going to look very, very different. And the key word you want to emphasize in your notes is change. Tremendous change, you will notice, at the time of the Roaring Twenties. And once again, I go back to these 4 ladies known as flappers, pushing the envelope in terms of what is considered to be appropriate behavior and appropriate dress attire for the time. Remember, this is over 100 years ago, or going on 100 years ago. Now, one of the big changes you're going to notice in the Roaring Twenties is going to be political change. And in actuality, some of the political changes will transpire prior to the start of this great decade. It's a great decade to talk about. The Roaring Twenties reminds me of the big hair 80s. You guys weren't even born, obviously, yet. Again, my college years when I started teaching was in the big hair 80s. It was just a fun decade. And that's the way I would describe the 20s. It was just a fun decade. But it was also a time of tremendous change. You didn't see the kind of changes in the big hair 80s that you would in the Roaring Twenties. So, for example, one of the biggest political changes that's going to really change, no pun intended, women and their role in American society is what's called the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment, of course, was ratified first by, again, Congress, 2/3 vote, both the House of Reps and the Senate. And then you need at least 2/3 of an agreement vote to ratify it in the states. So 2/3 of the states have to agree to it. And in 1920, the 19th Amendment becomes part of our Constitution. And what the 19th Amendment did, and you should draw a line off to the side, suffrage means giving women the right to vote. Now, 3 years later, 1923, women are saying, if we're good enough to vote, why aren't we good enough to work other jobs? Why do we have to work the same jobs? And if they're working the same job as a dude, as a guy, women are now saying, but wait a minute, why aren't we making the same kind of money that the guys are? So in 1923, there was a push for what's called the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, the ERA was never actually ratified. It was never ratified by the states. Now, what's interesting is you fast forward 50 some years into the future in the 1970s, and the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, came back again when I was your age. And it came a lot closer to being ratified. It still officially has not been ratified. It's still out there. And there's still a chance that eventually someday the states, in working in conjunction with Congress, the House of Reps, the lower house, and the Senate, the upper house, finally the Equal Rights Amendment will be ratified. Equal Rights Amendment was just simply about what it says. Equal rights. I would draw a line off to the side. Add this as a side oral note. Equal rights for women, the same as men. And one of the things that women were looking for, the same as men, was the same opportunities. And how about the same pay? If a woman is doing the same job as a dude, why are they making the same money? I agree 100%, but that's not the way it was, kids, 100 plus years ago. Now, when you talk about the Equal Rights Amendment, and you talk about the 19th Amendment, which was ratified. 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. The key player you have to talk about is a gal by the name of Alice Paul. And ladies and gentlemen, again, if you direct your attention up to the overhead screen, that is a photograph of Alice Paul. Alice Paul was absolutely instrumental in not only the 19th Amendment being ratified, but she was the one that was really pushing the envelope for the Equal Rights Amendment to be ratified. It came close, but it was actually rejected in the 1920s, barely rejected 50 plus years into the future in the 1970s when I was a kid growing up in Chicago. All right, so I want you guys to skip a full page, go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. We're going to come back to those notes. Don't you worry. Once again, I'd like for you to date your notes again for today. It is October 12th. It's 2021. And you're going to write down for me guide questions, Alice Paul. So this is a video clip I found a couple years ago on Alice Paul. Does a great job of basically summarizing, synthesizing, and tying together the loose ends of who Alice Paul was. So I just introduced her. Now the video clip is going to go into a lot more detail. All right, here we go. Number one, we're going to go through these guide questions quickly. Remember, you're going to need to pause the Zoomcast to give yourself a chance to catch up, and that's fine. So number one, I want you to explain for me what molded and shaped her ideals, her being Alice Paul's ideals, beliefs. Skip a line or two. Remember, that's where you're going to take your notes. Number two, what happened to Alice Paul in 1917 when World War I just started for the United States? And part two, what was the outcome of what happened to Alice Paul in 1917? So, ladies and gentlemen, this video clip is not real lengthy. It's about a minute, a little over a minute and 20 seconds-ish. That's why there weren't a lot of guide questions. Keep in mind, this video clip will absolutely be fair game for your next assessment. First progress/mastery check on the Roaring Twenties. Here we go. Alice Paul.
Born in 1885 in Mont Laurel, Alice Paul dedicated her life to the cause of securing equal rights for women. The story of how a bright girl raised in relative comfort on a farm could become the architect of some of the most important political achievements on behalf of women in history is one of inspiration and motivation. Alice Paul's ideals were formed by the Quaker philosophy of gender equality and her mother's interest in the growing women's movement. Her leadership energized the campaign for women's rights, and she worked tirelessly for a voting rights amendment to the Constitution. Jailed in 1917, Alice was beaten, punished, and force-fed, causing a public outcry. As a result, Congress reversed its position, and the 19th Amendment was passed in August of 1920. The memory and legacy of this great woman live on through the Alice Paul Institute in South Jersey, and we are proud to induct her into the New Jersey Hall of Fame.
So a couple of takeaways tying in and dovetailing into the guide questions. Number one, so yes, it was her religious upbringing that had a tremendous influence on her desire for equality for women. And number two, think about this in 1917. All she wants to do is give women the right to vote. And as a result of that desire, she was imprisoned. And you understand what force feeding means. So she went on a hunger strike. She was protesting the fact that women were not allowed to vote. And the jailers literally forced food down her throat, sometimes raw eggs. And it was simply because of the fact that she wanted women to have some measure of equality through the act of voting. So, ladies, when you turn 18 and you're registered to vote, that's one of the most important responsibilities you have as a good civic citizen. And you're sitting here and saying, well, I don't know if I have time to vote today. It's so cumbersome and tiring and tedious and all that. Think about the sacrifices that, again, people, women like Alice Paul made way back in 1917, over 104 years ago, all because she wanted women to have the right to vote. Think about that when next time or the first time you have the opportunity to vote. All right, let's continue on. Go back to the previous page where you're taking your regular notes. Let's continue on. So besides Alice Paul, and we talk about women pushing the envelope for, again, equality. And in this instance, it's not economic equality, but it's political. So you have your first female governors during the Roaring Twenties. So for example, number one, Nellie Taylor Ross, governor of the great state of Wyoming, our neighbors to the west. If you direct your attention up to the overhead screen, this is a photograph of Nellie Taylor Ross. That was actually her campaign poster. And if you notice it, Nellie Taylor Ross, candidate for re-election, governor of Wyoming. So she was running again. I want you to notice again how fashionably she was dressed with the hat, and notice her face. Same as the flappers. You notice what she's wearing, ladies? She's wearing makeup. Women in the Victorian era, 20, 30 years earlier, would have never been caught outside wearing makeup. But in the 20s, women were starting to push the envelope. Here's another lady, very significant. Her name is Miriam A. Ferguson. And Miriam A. Ferguson became the very first governor, female governor of the great state of Texas. Hook'em horse. Mrs. Temez, of course, went to school, University of Texas at Austin. And ladies and gentlemen, if you direct your attention to the overhead screen, this is a photograph of Miriam A. Ferguson, who, notice her in terms of her hairstyle and even her attire, a lot more like what you would have seen in the Victorian era 130 years ago. And then finally, now you also have your first female congresswoman. Now, but here's the catch with the first female congresswoman. She wasn't elected to Congress in the 1920s. She was actually elected in 1916. But she was a member of Congress throughout the Roaring Twenties. And her name was Jeannette Rankin. So I always include her with this illustrious group because Jeannette Rankin was first elected to the House of Representatives, to Congress, more specifically the lower house, the great state of Montana. And you know, it's interesting when you talk about women's rights and women pushing the envelope for equality, it's interesting that the more progressive states were not in the Midwest or the East or West Coast, but it's your states in the mountain states, if you will, Wyoming, Montana, Colorado. They tended to be a lot more forward thinking when it came to equality for women. And if you direct your attention up to the overhead screen, that of course is a photograph of Jeannette Rankin, whom I would argue is one of the most important women in terms of pushing the envelope for women gaining greater political power and respect at the same time. And it really goes back to Jeannette Rankin. So once again, I'd like for you to skip a full page. I'd like you to go to the right side of the next clean sheet of paper. Make certain that you date your notes again. For today, it is October 12th, 2021. And this time you're going to write down for me guide questions, Jeannette Rankin. All right. So once again, I'm going to provide you guys some guide questions. Write these guide questions down. Remember, you use the guide questions to assist your note-taking. No one's going to do this for you when you go to Stevenson next year. You're going to be expected to take your own notes without any guidance. Remember, when you're done, all the guide questions and the notes have to be highlighted. If you're not highlighting, you're not studying. If you're not studying, you're setting yourself up for not a great grade on your next assessment. Number one, I want to know, what did Jeannette Rankin do as a little girl and most girls did not do? So something she did as a little girl that a lot of her contemporaries would never have done kind of sets the wheels into motion. Remember to skip a line or two between your guide questions. Number 2, what is a suffragist? That's a word you absolutely need to know from the Roaring Twenties. Number 3, what is a pacifist? And the second part of the question, what were Jeanette Rankin's views about World War I, the Great War? We'll be studying World War I after Thanksgiving break, between Thanksgiving, after Thanksgiving break, post-Thanksgiving break, all the way up until winter break. The Great War starts in 1914, ends in 1918 in November. The United States enters this world conflict in 1917, 3 years later. And I want to know, just curious, what was Jeanette Rankin's views about World War II? Yes, she was still a member of Congress, the House of Representatives, when, of course, World War II will be brought to home in the United States. Now, the war starts in 1939, but the United States once again waits and does not participate in World War II until December 8th, 1941. Next guy question. What other famous pacifists did Jeanette Rankin meet with? So again, one of your guide questions earlier was about a pacifist. So this dovetails nicely back to that guide question. Next guide question. What war did Jeanette Rankin protest in a famous march in 1968? So she lived a very long life. So she was very, very outspoken about 3 wars: World War I, World War II, and now this war, which I won't give away. Got to watch the video. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to continue on. So this video is a little lengthier. It's about 2 minutes and 50 seconds long. Jeanette Rankin, arguably one of the most influential female congresspersons, again, impacting women in the Roaring Twenties. Here we go.
Girl growing up in Montana, Jeanette Rankin chose to do things most girls didn't want to do, like fix machinery and build things. Born in 1880, Jeanette graduated from college with a degree in biology. Not sure what she wanted to do with her life, she tried dressmaking and furniture design, but didn't like either one. She also received marriage proposals, but turned them down. After attending Moore College in Washington State, Jeanette became aware of the women's suffrage movement and joined it. Suffragettes were women who were working to get the government to give women the right to vote. Jeanette felt problems in the United States government could be solved if women got involved. She helped organize and promote the National American Women's Suffrage Association. In 1916, Jeanette decided to run for Congress in her home state of Montana and worked hard to be elected. She traveled long distances throughout her large state and gave speeches at railroad stations, street corners, potluck dinners, and schoolhouses. She won the election and became the first woman elected to the United States Congress. At the time of her election, not all states gave women the right to vote. Decisions were being made in Congress for suffrage, and Jeanette got the chance to be the first woman voting for women's rights to vote. Jeanette was a pacifist, which means she was against war and violence. When the vote came before Congress to enter World War I, she and a few other congressmen voted against it, but lost. After the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, she was the only member of Congress to vote against entering the war. She was hated for this, and her life was threatened, but she refused to change her vote and stayed true to her decision to be a pacifist. She didn't run for Congress again until 1940. Between her 2 terms, she organized social clubs for children in the state of Georgia and campaigned for social welfare programs. She continued to lecture on pacifism. After serving her 2nd term in Congress, Jeanette traveled the world and often visited with Mahatma Gandhi, who was also a famous pacifist. In the United States, she led a march of 5,000 to protest the Vietnam War. She died in 1973 at the age of 93. She left money to start a women's scholarship fund, which still helps women today. She is honored with a statue in the United States Capitol's Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C.
Again, truly, Jeanette Rankin was truly a remarkable individual. Just kind of dovetailing off the point was made, December 8th, 1941, again, December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy. President Franklin Roosevelt, as he coined that phrase the next day, that, of course, is when the Japanese military attacked our main naval base in Hawaii. It was called Pearl Harbor. And as a result of this, again, the surprise attack, it basically brought the United States into World War II. People are pretty upset about this. But Jeanette Rankin, wasn't that she was supporting the Japanese in terms of their militarism, or again, it's the same time you had Adolf Hitler, Schicklgruber, taking over Europe between 1939 and 1941. He had conquered a big swatch of Europe. It wasn't that Jeanette Rankin was supporting the Japanese military or Nazism. It's just that she was, again, a pacifist, is morally and ethically opposed to war because of the violence that's involved. I thought it was also very powerful that she did reach out and connect with Mahatma Gandhi. You'll be learning about Mohandas K. Gandhi next year in world history, one of the truly most remarkable figures, not only in the history of India in the 20th century, but also over the last millennium. He basically came up with the idea of nonviolent resistance, which we'll come back to again when we talk about the civil rights movement, and the fact that Jeanette Rankin, also was instrumental. She was very vocal, her feelings about the Vietnam War between 1965 and 1973. Let's go back to our notes. All right, here we go. So we just learned about some political changes. You learned about, again, the 19th Amendment, which was ratified. You learned about, of course, the Equal Rights Amendment, never ratified in the 1920s. Alice Paul was instrumental, but again, was brought back in the 1970s, barely rejected. It's still on the books. There's still talk. They may still try to ratify it today. You learn about, again, some of the great political female leaders, governors, Nellie Taylor Ross from the great state of Wyoming. You had, again, Miriam A. Ferguson from Texas. You learn about Jeanette Rankin, again, the first female congressperson from the great state of Montana. Now let's talk about economic changes. Economic, when I do this with my fingers, money. Now, when you talk about economic changes of the Roaring '20s, this is what I always try to focus on. So if you would write this down. So in the Roaring '20s, what you notice is more and more Americans in the Roaring '20s are going to be investing in what's called the stock market. And what they're doing is they're buying stocks. So when you buy stocks in a company or a corporation, what you are in essence doing, a stock is another word we use as a share. You're buying a share of that company. You're buying a share of that corporation. Now, it's a win-win situation because if I'm a corporation and people are buying shares of my company, I'm getting money and I can use that money to reinvest in my business. Maybe I buy another factory. Maybe I hire more workers. Maybe I buy new machines. As a stockholder or shareholder, it helps me is because if the corporation does well, I'm going to make money along with the boss, the person who owned the company. But whoever owns the most shares in the company or corporation, they ultimately are the boss. Now, keep in mind that when you are buying shares or stocks in a company or corporation, it's a classic reward risk situation. The reward is you can make a lot of money. But the risk is, but what if the corporation doesn't do well? All that money, all the shares you bought would be lost. Now, in the 1920s, what you're noticing is a lot of Americans are really heavily investing in the stock market, more than any other previous decade. The stock market goes back actually over 100 years prior to this. But now it's something in the Roaring '20s that you notice the average American now is really taking notice. So why are they becoming so invested in the stock market? And the answer is because if you look at the vast heart of the Roaring '20s, the stock market, again, the buying and selling of shares or stocks in companies or corporations, it experienced what we call a bull market. So a bull market simply means that over a sustained period of time, the value of the stocks keeps increasing. So the more that the value keeps going up, depending on how many shares or stocks you have in that company or corporation, that means you're going to be making more and more and more money. So a lot of people in the Roaring Twenties saw the stock market as the best way of getting rich. So if you direct your attention to the old red screen, this is one of Mr. Bonk's, again, humorous points of this is a bull market, but a bull market means, again, the value of the stocks is going up. Now, a bear market is the opposite. A bear market means the value of the stocks is going down. This is former Bears quarterback Jay Cutler, who never quite panned out the way everybody thought he was going to become the next great quarterback of the Chicago Bears. Just didn't work out that way. That's a bear market. Now, a bear market, again, just simply means that over a sustained period of time, the value of the stock starts to go down, whether it's Jay Cutler or former governor, Mitch Trubisky. All right, so here's the next point, though, I want to make. So you have to ask the question, at what point is it the optimal time to buy shares or stocks in the stock market? Is it better to buy stocks in the stock market in a bull market, or is it better to buy stocks in a bear market? So here's what I want you to do. I want you to pause the Zoomcast now, draw a line off the side, and tell me what's the best time to buy stocks. Bull or bear market? Take 2 minutes, go. So what I'm going to do at this point, once you're done writing this brief reflection, when is the best optimal time to buy stocks? When the market is increasing in value, that's a bull market, or when the market is decreasing in value, that's a bear market. So what I'm going to do is my next Zoomcast, I'm going to share a video clip with you on the stock market, talking about the Roaring Twenties and how some of the decisions that Americans were making in terms of investing in the stock market will ultimately help contribute to one of the worst economic crises in American history. And that, of course, is the Great Depression, our second topic that we'll be covering in Unit 2, my mistake. And then finally, again, I asked the question, when is the best time to invest in the stock market? Do you A, invest when the market is a bull market and the value is going up, or B, do you invest in a bear market when the value of the stocks is going down consistently? You tell me. So ladies and gentlemen, that's going to wrap up today's Zoomcast, again, for Tuesday. And that, of course, is October 12th, 2021, which also happens to be my younger brother Joe's 57th birthday. So at this point, I want everybody to take out your correctable tape. Again, I'm starting to see some sloppiness. This is a portfolio. Your ISN is a portfolio of your absolute best effort. Clean up anything you crossed out or traced over. That's number one. There's no doodling or drawing. This is not an art class. This is a social studies class. Number two, now you need to take out your multiple colored highlighters. Remember, tip of the tip. Don't be highlighting entire sentences or phrases. That's too much. That's coloring. Highlighting is a strategy. I want you to focus again on those words, those persons, places, or things, and really focus on highlighting them because it's going to conjure up pictures in your mind. Then you're going to go back and you're not going to pack up. If you finish early, which I doubt, but if you finish early, you're then going to go backwards and you're going to review your ISN, the 10 to 15 minutes every day. You practice for soccer, you practice for baseball, you practice for swimming. Why aren't you practicing for school every day? That's how you get in shape. Not physically, but remember, mentally and emotionally. If you have an opportunity, hand your ISN to somebody in your house, your mom, your dad, a brother, a sister, maybe an aunt or an uncle that had me decades earlier. Hand them your ISN. You teach them about the political changes of the Roaring Twenties. What's a flapper? Show them the photograph. What do you think a flapper was? Remember the visual discovery? And who were some of the first female governors? Who was Nellie Taylor Ross and Miriam A. Ferguson? What about Jeanette Rankin? What did she do? And don't forget Alice Paul. And what was the Equal Rights Amendment? Was it ever ratified? And what about the 19th Amendment? How did that change the course of history, especially for the ladies? And if you do that, I guarantee you that you will develop mastery. But remember what I keep saying again and again and again, you have to not memorize, tell the story. So, ladies and gentlemen, again, I hope you'd enjoyed today's Zoomcast. Again, for my next Zoomcast, I will share that video clip with you on the stock market and how the stock market in the roaring 20s is going to absolutely contribute to the Great Depression. So, as I always like to say, ladies and gentlemen, the bottom line is this: the story may have ended today, but you know the saga is going to continue tomorrow. And the rest, as we say, everyone, is history. Peace out, everybody. Thank you so much. And as always, be well.